Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to participate in the debate arising from your ruling earlier this evening of a prima facie breach of privilege involving 18 members in this House who were targeted by the Beijing-based communist regime as part of a hacking operation, a progressive reconnaissance attack due to their affiliation with the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, or IPAC. This attack occurred in early 2021, and for 3 years, these members were kept in the dark, which is completely unacceptable. And so I welcome your ruling, because here we go again. Here we go again 1 year later. 1 year ago, we were having a very similar debate in this House based upon the ruling of your predecessor of a prima facie breach of privilege concerning the member for Wellington-Halton Hills. That was referred to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, in which a report was recently tabled in this House finding that indeed the privileges of the member for Wellington-Halton Hills were violated for the very same reason as the 18 members of Parliament who have raised this matter, or who are subject to the matter of your ruling. And that is that the member for Wellington-Halton Hills was kept in the dark, that he was being targeted by Beijing, that his family in Hong Kong was being targeted by the Beijing-based regime. Mr. Speaker, this hacking attack did occur in 2021. It was reported by the U.S., by the FBI, to the Communications Security Establishment, to this government in 2022. And yet, like the member for Wellington-Halton Hills, many of the 18 members first learned that they were being targeted by Beijing not through a briefing, but through a report in the Globe and Mail. And it raises serious questions as to why it is that this came to light, in terms of the Globe and Mail reporting on it, not based upon information from this government, but from the U.S. government. Indeed, it was an unsealed indictment of the Justice Department in earlier this year that resulted in the IPAC Secretariat becoming aware that members of IPAC were targeted, not only Canadian members of Parliament, but other parliamentarians from around the world who were part of IPAC. That in turn led IPAC to ask questions of the Department of Justice in the U.S. as well as the FBI as to why members were not informed. And the FBI said, well, due to jurisdictional issues, we couldn't communicate directly to them, we couldn't directly brief them, but we did, as soon as possible, provide that information to the Government of Canada, more specifically to the Communications Security Establishment. And from there, that information went into a black hole, just as it did with respect to the targeting of the member for Wellington-Halton Hills. What is also disturbing is that, once again, the excuse being offered by the government is that it is not our fault. It's someone else's fault. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I think I have 20 minutes. Yeah, okay, thank you. Mr. Speaker, when the Globe and Mail reported that the member for Wellington-Halton Hills was being targeted by the Beijing-based regime, the Prime Minister first claimed that he learned about it in the Globe and Mail. Then he said that it was CSIS's fault. He said, and I'll quote what he said to the media at the time, quote, "CSIS made the determination that it wasn't needed to be raised to a higher level because it wasn't a significant enough concern," end of quote. And then it was revealed that what the Prime Minister said wasn't true, that information had in fact been passed on to the Prime Minister's department, the PCO, to the Prime Minister's National Security and Intelligence Advisor, and that information was not acted upon. It wasn't shared with the member for Wellington-Halton Hills. Nothing was done. But again, the Prime Minister was very quick to blame someone else, to blame CSIS. The same is true of the Minister of Public Safety. It was learned at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, or during the study that we undertook, that on the question of privilege, that in fact CSIS had sent an IMU to the Minister of Public Safety, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, and the Minister of Public Safety's Chief of Staff, alerting them about the fact that the member for Wellington-Halton Hills and his family were being targeted by Beijing. And when the Minister of Public Safety came to committee, he, just like the Prime Minister, said that it wasn't his fault, that it was CSIS's fault, that somehow CSIS had made an operational decision not to inform him. He said that repeatedly, unequivocally. It wasn't a misstatement. It was those were carefully selected words by the Minister of Public Safety that were patently not true. How could CSIS have made an operational decision not to inform the Minister of Public Safety when it sent to him an IMU addressed to him, his Deputy Minister, and his Chief of Staff? It is patently absurd. And when the Director of CSIS came before the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and I asked him what was the significance of an IMU, he said that it was a matter of high importance. It's not just any memo that was sent. It was sent specifically to get the Minister of Public Safety's attention. And so not only did the Minister not act upon the intelligence concerning the member for Wellington-Halton Hills, not only does he bear responsibility along with the Prime Minister and the government for keeping that member in the dark that led to a breach of that member's privilege, but the Minister may not have been entirely forthcoming with all of the facts in a desperate and pathetic effort to blame someone else. Because, Mr. Speaker, with these Liberals and this Prime Minister, they're not responsible. And it is true, they're not responsible. They are not a responsible government. But when it comes to taking responsibility, it's always someone else's fault. So here we go again. Another instance, this time 18 members of Parliament, kept in the dark for 2 years. 2 years, and I say it was 3 years from the time of the attack, but 2 years from the time that the government was informed by the FBI. And what is the excuse offered by the Liberals? Well, it was a decision of House of Commons administration. Somehow it was the House of Commons administration's fault, not the government's fault. I say that that is completely unacceptable in terms of an excuse for keeping members of Parliament in the dark about something as serious as a progressive attack against them. An attack that, yes, began at a low level, but it was an attack that was aimed at gathering information about them, information that could have impeded their ability to do their work as members of Parliament, that could have threatened their safety and security and those that they meet with, including members of diaspora communities that are targeted by the Beijing-based communist regime. For these Liberals to simply pass the buck to House of Commons administration on something like this is a complete abdication of responsibility. At the end of the day, ultimate responsibility lies with this government, and in that regard, this government completely failed. But I would submit it was more than just a failure. I would submit that for these Liberals, that information that had been passed on to them by the FBI was inconvenient. They didn't want to pass that information on to members because it might result in members putting pressure on the Liberals to actually do something, to take action in response to the Beijing-based regime, which I will remind you the Prime Minister said was a dictatorship that he admired. He admired their basic dictatorship. This is a Prime Minister that extended his hand time and again to the Beijing-based regime. This is a Prime Minister that turned a blind eye to Beijing's interference in our democracy because, as he saw it, it was benefiting the Liberal Party. And so, Mr. Speaker, we need to get to the bottom of what happened, about who learned, where this information went, and why members were left in the dark. Why it took information from the U.S. Department of Justice in an unsealed indictment that led to IPAC raising questions that in turn resulted in members of Parliament being, in some cases, informed by IPAC, and in other instances through the report in the Globe and Mail. And, Mr. Speaker, let me observe more broadly that when it comes to foreign interference, and specifically interference by the Beijing-based regime, which is the largest threat when it comes to interfering in Canada, in targeting diaspora communities, in terms of interfering in our democracy, our sovereignty, and targeting the safety of, or impacting the safety of Canadians, that this government's record is an abysmal one. They simply cannot be trusted to stand up to the Beijing-based regime. This is, as I noted, a government that turned a blind eye to Beijing's interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections, notwithstanding that the Prime Minister had been repeatedly briefed about that interference. He covered it up when Global News and the Globe and Mail first reported upon it in the fall of 22 and early 23. The Prime Minister tried to downplay it. He's not able to downplay it now that the first report of Madam Justice Hogue was issued last week, which is a damning indictment on this Prime Minister in many respects. This is a government that, under its watch, has had police stations operating in communities across Canada targeting Chinese Canadians. At least 2 of those stations remain open. This government, not only under this government's watch were these police stations operating, this government was actually funding some of the organizations that were operating the police stations. This is a government, or at least under this government's watch, in which there was a major national security breach at the Winnipeg lab, Canada's highest security lab, in which agents of the Beijing regime transferred sensitive materials to PRC institutions, including the transfer of 2 of the most deadly pathogens, Ebola and Hennepin, at the direction of one of those scientists, and that happened even after PHAC had a fact-finding report indicating that that scientist had breached multiple security and intellectual property policies of PHAC, and that individual had collaborated on an unauthorized basis with Beijing. And nonetheless, under this government's watch, Hennepin and Ebola were sent over to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. At the Winnipeg lab, military scientists had access to the lab, someone who was working with Beijing's foremost expert in bioterrorism and biodefense. And the list goes on and on and on. It's pretty incredible. And it is what happens after 9 years of a Prime Minister who is unserious, who doesn't take foreign interference seriously, who doesn't take these threats seriously, a Prime Minister whose Chief of Staff came to committee and said the Prime Minister reads everything put on his desk, and that he's frequently briefed. And then we learn when the Prime Minister appears at the foreign interference inquiry that he actually doesn't read really anything at all.
Really?
And so what we have is a Prime Minister at best that is asleep at the switch, and at worst a Prime Minister who has at times turned a blind eye and even been willing to go along with Beijing's interference so long as it benefits the electoral interests of the Liberal Party. Mr. Speaker, in closing, this prima facie question of privilege that you have ruled on, the facts underlying it, are a matter that should never have happened.
It's true.
And the government can point blame at everyone else all they want, but a directive was finally issued in 2023 to inform members of Parliament. It shouldn't have taken until 2023 for that directive to have been issued, but it was issued in 2023. And still no action was taken. Still the members were kept in the dark. Why were they not informed at the very least after that directive was issued? These are among the questions that need to be answered. There needs to be accountability for this very, very serious breach. What I believe is, not just a prima facie breach, but I believe the privileges of those 18 members were violated. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.